screen really quick, and then we'll be underway. Can everyone see my screen right now? You should see a slide that's called Intro to CSS. Cool. All right, so for CSS, like I said, it's really pretty much based upon this idea of visually styling, right? Yesterday in HTML, we talked about how to make the raw components of the website. So if I want to make a text or an image or a link, how do I actually create those elements? Well, now that we're past that stage, once we've created the elements, the next question becomes, well, how do we make them look pretty, right? And not just from a purely kind of superficial reason, but how do we make them convey information more clearly? And also, how do we add some more advanced functionality to that? And CSS helps us do a lot of those two things. It probably does more on in the former camp in terms of making the information just laid out a little bit better, make it a little bit more visually pleasing. But CSS does also have some functionalities that allow us to add functionality to it as well. So CSS basically helps us determine two things. The first one is it helps us pick which elements we want to change. And then secondly, it asks us or allows us to determine how we actually want to change them. So here, and we'll kind of cover this in a little bit, but here, all I'm trying to do is I'm trying to select all of the list elements on a page. Remember the li tag from yesterday? Well, it kind of pops up again here, but without the carets, but we're still, in this case, referring to the list item. And all we're trying to say is, let's change the color of the text to blue. And when we do that, it's going to happen. And so this is pretty much the very basis for CSS. It allows us to do two things once again. It helps us pick the elements we want to change, and then it allows us to specify how we actually want to change them. So today we're going to talk about the syntax for writing CSS rules. We're going to talk about different ways to choose the elements that we want to change, and then lastly we'll go through some, but definitely not all, of the style properties that we can use. Right? What are all the different parts of the element that we are able to change? So if HTML yesterday was about creating the raw content, and if CSS by itself is talking about style, then when we put those two things together, now we're starting to create the layout of a robust, usable web page. So the page on the left is something you might see on I think that's taken from the MDN website, which is just a repository for documentation. If you look at it, the information is pretty clear, right? The menu bar at the top makes it very clear that we can change languages, we can edit the page. The titles make it clear that we're looking at CSS. On the bottom, we have some links to look at more information. And most importantly, in the middle of the page, we see a very clear distinction between the paragraph text of the page as well as a gray box, which shows us the actual code that we're writing on the page, right? And so if someone looks at that page without going into too much detail, it makes it pretty clear kind of where the pieces are and how the information is laid out. On the right-hand side, we had that same exact page, except we've taken out all the CSS. That is, we've taken out all of the styling and formatting. And so all we have left are the basic raw HTML elements. Everything we can do on the left-hand page, we can also do in the right-hand page. But notice how much more unclear and how much more not intuitive the page on the right-hand side is. So even though CSS may be sometimes seen as optional, or hey, we're just kind of dressing it up or making it look pretty, if we actually compare these two web pages as the way they're currently constructed, it becomes very clear that CSS is actually incredibly valuable for us to be able to add the proper functionalities to web pages as well. So how do we think about how to write a CSS rule? And essentially, if we go back to 2 slides ago, remember what I said. The only two things that CSS allows us to do is, one is it allows us to pick the element we want to change, and then two is it lets us say what that change is. And so here in this block of text, we pretty much have a very, not basic, but we already have the fundamentals of a CSS rule. And so this whole thing here is called a rule. This is a criteria that we're going to apply to the HTML elements and say, take these elements and change them in this way. Now let's walk through each part of the rule in more detail. So hopefully it's a little more clear. Here, we will, in the middle of here, in this highlighted, in the gray highlighted portion, what we have is something called a declaration. That is, this is one change that we want to make. Okay, and in this case, just kind of walk through it from left to right. The first thing that we always have is going to be the property, right? what is the aspect of the element that we're trying to change. And in this case, for this particular declaration, the property that we're trying to change is the border. That is, we're trying to change the border of the element. The colon then separates the property from the value. So before the colon, to the left of the colon, what we have is the property or the aspect or the part of the element we want to change. And on the right-hand side of the colon, what we have is the value that we want to change that property to. In this case, we're trying to change the border to the value of 1 pixel, solid border, and then red border, followed by a semicolon. The colon separates the property from the rule, and then the semicolon at the very end tells us that, hey, we're at the end of the declaration. Okay. And so if we look at this page here, the gray highlighted portion here is one declaration, and right beneath it we have another declaration, which is font style, colon, italic, semicolon. So between the curly braces we see on this page, what we actually have are two declarations or two changes we want to make. Okay. All the declarations are going to be contained between the open and closed curly braces that we see on the page. If we look at the first line, the last character there is the open curly brace. And if we look at the very last line, the last element there, or the last character there is a closed curly brace. So the curly braces are basically create the container for all of our declarations. And in it, all we have are a list of declarations or a list of changes we want to make. Once again, the colon separates the property, so what we wanted to change, from the value, what we want to change it to. And every declaration ends with a semicolon. Whenever I see a semicolon, it means I'm done with this particular declaration or this particular change, and I'm ready to move on to the next change. So if this is declaration, and collectively and together these declarations represent all the changes we want to make to the elements, the next question becomes, well, how do we pick the elements that we want to change? And what that comes through with all of the text or all the code that we write before the declaration. So all of the things here we call the selector. Now this is a pretty complicated selector, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about what it is. We'll talk more about that in subsequent slides. But at the very fundamental basis, that's a property and that's the value. At the very fundamental basis, just note that across all of this, all the CSS rule is trying to say to us is, let's apply these styles. So in this case, we're applying the changes to borders as well as the changes to the fonts. We're applying it to all of the elements that match this selector. Okay, the selector once again lets us pick the elements, and we'll talk more about them on subsequent slides. But once again, the CSS rule, all it is saying is, let's apply these styles to all the elements that match this selector or this criteria. And when we put all these things together, we basically have a CSS rule that we can apply. And so when we talk about writing CSS, all we're really talking about is writing several of these rules, right? The rules could be something like, take all of the text on this page and make them bold, or take all the text on the page and make them green, or take all of the P tags, or take all of the H1 tags and make the text bold, right? These are all things that we can do to it, and all CSS is really asking us to do is just pick the elements you want to change and then tell us what the changes you want to make to those elements are. Actually, let me stop here. Are there any questions so far on kind of the basic layout of a CSS rule?
I have a question.
Yeah.
For a specific paragraph, so you give it an ID, can you apply a rule to that specific ID?
Yep, and that's exactly what we'll talk about on the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah, so leading into that then, let's talk a little bit more about this first thing, right? I think the declarations or changes are very intuitive, right? But it seems like the selector is a little bit more trickier. And so on this issue of the selectors, let's talk about how we want to actually choose the elements that we want to change. Here on the very first line, what I have is I have a link tag, right? I know it's a link tag because I see the A in the opening tag. And after it, look at the attributes I've assigned to this, right? I've assigned a class with the value of David. I've assigned an ID with the value of full stack, and I've assigned an href with the value of www.google.com. And in between the A tag, I have the string text. Okay. Remember yesterday, we talked about how attributes are basically ways for us to add additional pieces of information to a given HTML element. Well, in this case, what we're really saying here is there's a lot of things we can use to identify this particular element, right? I can identify it based on its tag value. I can identify it based on its class value. I can also identify it based on its ID value. There's a few other things here too that we won't talk about nearly as much for this class, so I would just focus on the first three. But really quickly, if I want to talk about how do I want to pick out this element, or how do I denote, hey, I only want to change, or not only, but I want to change at least this element. Well, for the first thing I can say is, well, I would like to apply some kind of changes to all of the A tags on the page, right? Because fundamentally, this is an A tag, right? This is a link tag. What I can also say is, hey, let me change all of the elements that have a class value of David. And the way I do that is I denote it by saying dot David. Putting the dot in front of David, what that tells CSS is saying, okay, now you are picking all the elements with this particular class value. In this case, the class value is David. And the last way that we're going to talk about in terms of selecting a given element is based on the ID value. And the way we denote that I'm now talking about an ID is by putting a hashtag or a pound symbol in front of the ID value. Okay, and so just to kind of reiterate here, the selector, once again, it's just a criteria for us to say, give me all of the elements on the page that match this selector or this criteria. In this case, three possible criteria. The first one is by tag type. So in this case, we're looking at the A tag. The second one is by saying, give me all the elements that have a certain class value, and we denote the value by saying, dot and then the value, right? So a class value of David is just dot David. And then lastly, we can pick it by the ID as well, and we denote that by saying hashtag or pound sign and the ID value. So hashtag full stack says, give me the element that has the ID value of full stack. Everyone still with me so far?
Yeah. Question.
Yeah.
Yeah. For ID, when you do the hashtag full stack, and I think it was Python, I did this before, but it made it like null, and it made it so the program wouldn't it would like ignore the ID, or when you put a hashtag in front of something, it would just read it, so you could read it, whatever the wording that you had to follow. In CSS, when you put the hashtag before, it recognizes it as an ID. Does it do something? Like in Python, it didn't do it. It like ignored it, and it was just like you could do a hashtag and then type out a paragraph like, "These are the directions."
Well, so in Python, we're talking about it. The hashtag symbol is used to write comments.
Yeah. In this, for ID, does the hashtag do something? It actually has a use.
Yeah. In CSS, the hashtag denotes that it's an ID.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
Right. It's like it's like like a character may mean nothing in one language, but it can mean something very different in another language. And so there's zero kind of relationships between Python and CSS.
I'm really glad I asked that. So nothing I learned in Python carries over. Cool. All right. Sweet.
In Python, when we talk about JavaScript, you'll see a lot of Python carries over to JavaScript and vice versa. But CSS and to a large degree HTML, they're kind of in their own little buckets, and they don't really share a lot of common features with other more traditional programming languages.
Awesome.
So approach this from a kind of like a Python free thumb.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So so far what we talked about is saying, okay, I've now been able to say, give me an element that matches this criteria, and that will allow me to pick the elements I want to choose. But what CSS also does that's pretty powerful is it allows you to combine multiple criteria together, right? And so we'll talk about some of them here. Whenever you do a tag value and then dot class value, so here if I do a.david, what that tells CSS is grab me all the elements that match both criteria. It has to have the tag value of A as well as a class value of David, right? And so now by combining these different rules, we're actually able to go to we're able to be very specific in picking out the exact elements that we want. Similarly, if I do tag and then space dot class, what that says is give me an element with a given class value, but one of the ancestors, or if you remember the parent-child relationship we talked about yesterday, one of the parent or one of the ancestor elements has to match the given tag value. Essentially, what the space does is now it creates a certain sense of sequence, right? Tag.class with no space means give me an element that matches both criteria. Tag space.class means give me an element that has that class value, but at some point in this kind of element tree, it has to be a part of a given tag value. If we put a comma there instead, then we're saying give me an element that matches either the tag value or the .class value or both. And then lastly, this greater than sign tag greater than sign .class says give me an element with a given .class value, but whose parent matches the tag value, right? And the difference between the ancestor and the parent, just kind of like in a real family tree, is parent means the element that directly encompasses this element is a given value. Ancestor means it could be your parent, it could be your parents' parents, it could be your parents' parents' parents, but at some point somewhere the ancestor matches the tag. This can be a bit overwhelming to look at and understand intuitively right away. And so just note that for this class, for the most part, we're mostly going to be dealing with the first one and the third one. The first one I think is pretty intuitive, right? If I give you multiple rules, what I'm basically saying to you is give me an element that matches all of those rules. If I give you a selector with several conditions followed by commas, that means give me an element that matches either of those conditions. And pretty much, I think that's the extent of what we'll be dealing with in terms of the workshops for today. But we just want to, with number 2 and number 4, we just want to kind of bring it to your attention the level of complexity and depth and how specific we can be in terms of picking out elements with certain values.
I have
and
a
then,
question.
oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Can those be written in any order, or is that order specific?
So for the tag.class, as well as the tag comma.class, those can be a bit more flexible with the order. With number 2 and number 4, we can't change that order around, because notice how like the number 2 says give me an element with the .class value whose ancestor is a tag. If we switch around the order of those two things, now we're saying give us a tag value whose ancestor has the .class value, and we're asking for something fundamentally different. And so for some of these, you are able to kind of pick and choose the order in which you want to write them in. For some of them, there's a very kind of clear sequential. There's this very sequential command or directions, and so when we change the orders, we're actually changing the directions as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just curious if you can specify like a different parent, basically.
A different parent. So you mean for the very last one?
It just is an example, yeah. That was just one example. Like, I was just wondering if there's any other order you can use if you're not stuck or only able to use tag and class or dot class and then class dot tag. Just curious.
Okay, so on this one, the fourth one is saying tag and then the greater than sign dot class. That basically says give me an element with a given class value whose parent is that tag value. If we were to do is in the opposite order and we do dot class and then greater than and then tag, that basically says give me an element with a given tag value whose parent has that dot class value. So in most cases, we'll be looking at two different things then. Did you have an idea for an alternative way to write that you want to check?
So you can technically write dot class tag for the first one, and still give the same thing, or do you have to have that dot?
Okay, so let's just do a quick example then. Let me just make this really clear. Okay, whatever. I'll stick on JavaScript and then I'll just rewrite this later on. Okay. All right. So imagine I have okay, let's say I have a p tag, right? And then in this p tag, I have something here, and then here I have a span tag. And in the span tag, I have the word full stack. Okay, this is a very simple snippet of HTML, right? And then here, let's say I have a class equals, and then I'll say Lauren. So this is HTML. Now, if I say something like p greater than equal to .lorem, what this says is get me an element with a lorem class whose parent is a p tag. Okay. If I was to switch around the order of these two things now, and I say .lorem and then order p, now this says give me an element with a p tag whose parent has a lorem class. Right.
Okay, and that's so much more clear. Thank you.
Yeah, and so here in this case, we're looking at this span element here. In this case here, we actually get no response back because there is no element that's a p element whose parent also has a lorem class. And so by switching around, we've now kind of basically changed our criteria requirement. And in this case, there's not gonna be any element that matches this criteria. So for the ones in which there's a kind of a family tree relationship, order is actually extremely important because once you change the order, you're basically changing fundamentally what's being requested. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Any other questions from folks? Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about in terms of writing CSS and will be just to go back to something that I actually forgot who answered a question earlier. Comments, how to write comments in CSS. Once again, comments in CSS is the same as comments in HTML, which is actually the same as comments in any language, which is comments are always just code that you write, then notes you leave for future developers. They're meant for human consumption only. They have no bearing on how the code is actually being run. And the way to write a comment in CSS is just with the backslash asterisk, and then to close off the comment, we have an asterisk backslash. And so here, notice how on the first line, we have a comment that exists on one line. Then we have a CSS rule that finds all of the p tag elements on the page and changes the text color to blue. At the end of that declaration, we have another comment there. And then we have a multi-comment line followed by the very last rule, which just says, find me the element with the ID of foobar and change the background color equal to green, right? So as long as you use the backslash asterisk and you close off with the asterisk backslash, you can insert a comment anywhere you want in CSS. It won't impair how the code runs. It's purely meant for you to leave notes for other human developers. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about with regards to CSS is just this idea of what happens when multiple styles kind of come in conflict with each other. One of the reasons why we call this a cascading style sheet is because very often there's not just one set of rules saying change this to this, right? Very often there's many rules trying to make changes to the same element, and so it's actually up to us, or actually it's up to the computer to figure out, okay, which rules are most relevant or which rules apply. And in most cases, an element's style is actually a merge of all the rules that apply to that given element. So here on the top left-hand corner, looking under index.html, notice how we have a head link, which we have a head tag with two link elements in there. Don't worry about that for now. All that really is saying is let's apply styles a.css and styles b.css to the HTML elements on this page. If we look at our body tag on the bottom there, we have a body tag. Inside of it, we have a UL, an unordered list item, followed by a single list item with the letter A, right? In that list item, notice how in the HTML itself, we have something that's called style equals and then background color blue. If we look at the styles a.css right next in the box right next to it, we have a CSS rule that tries to change all the list elements on the page, the li that becomes our selector, and it tries to change all the font color equal to red. And then when we look at styles b.css, it also is trying to change all the list elements on the page, except it's trying to get the font size equal to 40 pixels. And so the question becomes, what does the final element look like? Well, what the final element looks like is is actually a combination of all of these different rules together, right? Here we have our list element, right? And we notice it's a list element because it has a bullet point in front of it, which tells us we're dealing with an unaware list. The text is A. Okay. If we look at the rule inside the HTML element, when we write the style or the format change directly into the HTML, we call it inline styling. That is, the style appears in line with the actual element itself. And what that style is saying is, let's make the background color blue. And indeed, when we look at the element, the background color is blue. If we look at the styles a.css, it's saying change the font color to red. And when we look at the A character, the color is indeed red. And then lastly, when we look at styles b.css, it's saying let's change the font size equal to 40 pixels. And when we look at that letter, we can assume that it's a pretty big character, so it's probably 40 pixels. And so here, we actually have three different set of styles, or three set of formatting, trying to change the same element. And at the end of the day, how that element's going to look is, it's not going to pick and choose one of those rules. It's going to do its best to apply all of those rules to that element. So the next question becomes then, okay, if I have an element and I'm trying to apply multiple rules to it, yeah, HTML or CSS will try its best to apply multiple rules to it. But what happens when those rules come in conflict? And that kind of is the big question that we're going to go through for the rest of this class. Just talking about when the rules don't conflict, then yeah, we'll just do all of it, right? But when the rules do conflict, which rule do we follow first? And so we'll just walk through a few quick examples here. And this is something that's a little bit tricky to understand the first time you see it. But the more you use it, hopefully the more you kind of develop an intuitive feel for how these conflicts are being resolved. So here at the top of the page, I have a div element which has an ID value equal to thing. Okay. On the left-hand side, I have a rule that says take all div elements and change the background color to red. On the right-hand side, I have a rule that says take all elements with the ID of thing and change the background color to blue. And so when I do this, which rule wins? The answer is change the background to blue rule wins. And the reason why that rule wins is because when we think about when we're trying to change the same element through multiple rules, the rule that is most specific always wins. And what do I mean when I say most specific? It just means the selector for that rule is the most precise, right? In this case, if I look at the rule on the left, I could have multiple divs on the page, right? I could have thousands of divs. But if I look on the right, this rule is saying change only the element with the ID of thing. And remember what we talked about yesterday. For the ID attribute, there should only be one element on a given page with that ID value. And so here, what we're really saying is there's only at most one possible element that this rule could apply to. And so therefore, this rule is more selective or more specific than the rule that changes all the divs. And so because of that, this rule takes priority, and we're going to change the background color to blue. So given that, if we take a look at another example here, at the top of the page, we have the same div element, except now rather than having an ID of equal to thing, now the class is equal to foo. On the left, we still have our rules saying change all divs backgrounds to red. On the right-hand side, we now say change all elements with a class of foo, change the background color to green. When these two rules conflict, which one wins? The .foo wins, or the rule that changes all of the elements with class of .foo wins, because specifying a class is more specific than specifying a type of tag, right? And so once again, we kind of come back to this idea that when multiple CSS rules conflict, the rule that is the most specific or the most precise wins. Here we have another example. We have a div element with an ID value of equal to thing, as well as a class value equal to foo space bar. And what the space does when I have in a class value is that basically says this given element has two class values, both foo and bar. And so if we look on the left-hand at the rule on the left-hand side, we see that the rule is saying, all right, find an element for me that has the ID of thing. And then on the right-hand side, the rule says, find me an element that has two class values of both foo and bar. So both rules apply. But the question becomes, when these two come in conflict, which one wins? And the answer is, the ID still wins, right? It doesn't matter if we add multiple classes to a given rule. The rule that is the most specific wins, and in the order of priority level or specificity level, ID is always the most specific, followed by class, and then lastly we follow up with tags. And then this is the last one we'll do is here we have on the left hand side we have a rule that changes an element with the ID of thing, and we change the font equal to 30. On the right hand side we have a dot outer and also dot foo. So we're trying to look for an element with a class of foo and also an element with a class of outer. But just know that space in the middle means we're looking for an element with a class of foo whose parent or whose ancestor has a class of outer. Okay, and we're changing the background color equal to green. But when we do this, which style actually wins? And the answer is neither of those two style wins, even though the rule on the left will still apply. And the reason for that is just because the anything that we write in CSS will always be a lower priority level or a lower precedence than inline styling. So if we go back to this kind of hierarchy of importance, right? Now at the very top, we can say the most important styling for an HTML element will always be whatever the inline style is. After that, the next most important thing is whatever the rules based on the ID value is. After that, it'll be whatever rule is based on the class value. And then lastly is whatever rules is based on the tag type. Okay, so now we have another hierarchy of inline style first, then ID, then class, then tag type. And so this is a funny cartoon that's kind of made the rounds a lot in terms of talking about CSS, in that like it may seem simple as the way that we've described it today so far in class, but when you start doing it, like it gets very confusing very quickly, because very often you're not trying to change one thing one way. You're trying to change multiple things many ways. And when something doesn't work, it's off like half the battle a lot of times is just trying to figure out like what's changing this, and more importantly is how do I change this element without impacting all of the other elements or all of the other elements around it. So one of the things we didn't talk about a lot in this presentation is just talking about all the different properties, right? What are the types of values we can change elements to? We kind of show a little bit with font size, with background color, with font style, whether you want something italicized or not. And the reason why we don't cover as much in the PowerPoint is because we do talk about a lot more in the workshop today. But essentially, it would just be me running through a list of values to you, and you won't memorize them nearly as well than if you had to write the code yourself, which we'll do in the workshop today. And so to kind of wrap all of this up, once again, don't be intimidated by CSS. Remember, every CSS rule is just trying to do two things. It's saying what elements do you want to change, and how do you want to change them, right? Most of what we've talked about today is in this idea of how do we pick which elements we want to change, and with multiple rules, how do we resolve the conflict? And the answer is whatever rule is most precise is the rule that wins, right? So inline style will always be the most precise because it's actually being applied to the element on the spot. The next level of precision will be based on an ID value, because we know an element can only have a given, or there can only be one element with a given ID on a page at a time, followed by class values, and then lastly, we follow up with tag type. So are there any questions before we break off today for the workshop?
Could you please go to slide 14?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Was there any questions or?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said that if you have an inline style, it's going to be higher priority. But say you have like